Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
And here we go. We're back. It is On the Ledge. Welcome in. Dave Trafford here. And we took a bit of a hiatus. And normally, if we took a couple of weeks off, it wouldn't feel so, odd. But it feels like a long time since we've been back in studio with the podcast, considering we're just coming off the vibe of the daily for On the Ledge, your Ontario politics podcast. And for those of you who hung in there and sort of were faithful viewers and listeners, thank you for doing that. A lot of you were new to the show as well. We can tell just by the numbers and how it popped up on the various platforms: Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, etc., and certainly on YouTube. So again, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, hit the subscribe button, and all of this show falls into your inbox with notifications every time we post it, along with Now and Next. And we've put that one, we've rebooted the show Now and Next as well this week. So we've got our cast in place, our comms and strategy team. So we get into some of the details. We focus a little bit more on the politics of Toronto, but we did get their take on the outcome of the provincial election. Okay, not much to talk about, so why don't we get to it? Keith Leslie is here. He is one of our longtime contributors to On the Ledge, and of course you see and hear him on CH television. John Wright is our founding pollster, and Tim Hudak, the former leader of the PC Party of Ontario and former Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne. Good to have you back. So I just, we all got our chance to sort of kick around the entrails post-election. Curious to know, and I know we talked a little bit about it last week after Mark Carney was coronated as the leader of the Liberal Party. But your take on the sort of the general landscape now in Ontario after we saw what the outcome vis-a-vis the election result.
You asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I've been watching online the postings of the new members who are the new Liberals who are going into the House, and all the new members doing their training. So it's sort of an exciting time. I think that as during the election, it's going to be all about the trade war. It's going to be all about how we can make Ontario stronger. That's what Ford ran on. I will be interested to watch how the other files go, and education, healthcare, housing, all of those things are urgent right now in the province, and they weren't talked about a lot during the election. So I'm a little bit worried about those files, but there's always renewed energy, and Tim will know that there's always renewed energy when the House comes back, and there'll be a throne speech, and we'll be off and running with a bunch of new members in the House, and we'll see how it goes. It's going to be an interesting session.
Yeah, and I understand, Tim, the idea that tariffs are still going to dominate the agenda. I mean, if you listen to the Premier's speech yesterday after the swearing-in ceremonies, it was just directed at the Americans. There wasn't very much at all about what was going to happen vis-a-vis, around the kitchen table in Ontario. He quoted Ronald Reagan. He talked about, the wars the Canadians fought in alongside the Americans. He really targeted the American audience here. And I understand why. I get that. That's the important part of it. But where's the diminishing return in terms of where we get too distracted and we don't talk about, okay, education really needs its attention right now. Healthcare needs attention right now. So those things need to be dealt with. Housing needs to be dealt with right now. Tariffs can't be the only file on this desk.
But it is a 5-alarm bell, right? It is a 5-alarm bell. So I'm happy to talk about cabinet and the education and health portfolios. Just to your first question there, Dave, about, takeaways from the election. Hall of Fame, like, honest to God, a premier now who has won 3 back-to-back majority governments with an increased share of the vote each time has not been done in Ontario's history. Credit to the premier, his performance, his leadership, and hats off to Corey Tenike and his campaign team that executed an excellent campaign, strategically smart. To the New Democrats, get a chance to fight another day and try to become the official opposition party and then move to government if they can be seen as more palatable to a broader array of voters. So Margaret Stiles gets a chance to fight another day, and they did a good job defending seats despite their overall vote going down. The Ontario Liberal Party, some of my colleagues have more insight into their chemistry, but I think it's going to be hard for Bonnie Crombie to be there for the next provincial election campaign, losing your seat, not winning a seat in Peel. 14 seats is an improvement, but man, they should have done better. And to survive, she's a relatively new leader. Do you have the team around you and the loyalty of the troops to get through a leadership review battle and contest another day? That's my main takeaway. Happy to come back to cabinet momentarily.
Again, I think that we do want to get to that, but just your take in terms of where is that line? I mean, where does the attention have to be centered? I get it on tariffs, trade, but when do we need to really make the point that, okay, we're here for 4 years, though. We can't just talk about trade and tariffs. It has to be a broader view. Peripheral vision has to be expanded a little bit to make sure that we've got healthcare, we've got education, we've got the big files that have to be taken care of, particularly housing. And you've been not shy in criticizing the government for failing on the housing file.
Yeah. So I got 85% on my pool for cabinet. The stakes weren't too hard this time because largely the key players stayed in place, but it is really purpose-built for the tariff war. So the major portfolios are largely the same. And then there's this economic basket. Stephen Lecce has got like my dream ministry, right? Energy, mines, connectivity, and broadband increase. You throw in booze there, and I would have been in heaven with that file, for goodness sakes. And in the middle of a trade war, right? That is a powerful ministry. Combine that with Pacini staying on at Labor, Vic Fideli Economic Development. So this is purpose-built for the trade war. To your point, Dave, are there gaps in health and education? Here's what I'll say no. So Paul Calandra, who's regarded as a fixer, a trusted person to put out fires, has been given education. We're clear the Premier feels they could do better. And Todd McCarthy, also a very talented communicator, real hands-on fixer, now gets the environment file. Two files where concerns are usually vulnerable. So I get your point, but I think they have those bases covered with some new talent in those files. Housing, great opportunity for Rob Flack, right? He's elevated quickly as agriculture minister, previously associate for housing. I'm going to encourage this with all my might through On the Ledge and talking to the minister personally. Housing can be the buoy for us to grab onto safely during a trade war. It is not an export sector. It's impacted, but not nearly as much. Such a large part of the economy. The time is now to really boost that sector to help us try to keep our head above water.
Keith, your take on the $189 million cabinet shuffle?
Well, I think there was a real missed opportunity here. I mean, obviously, again, agreeing with everyone, the focus is Trump and the tariffs, and we know the Premier's going to run with that ball. He kept intergovernmental affairs. But the one real missed opportunity to me was keeping Sylvia Jones as the Deputy Premier and the Minister of Health. The health file is just a disaster for this government. I mean, it's not just hallway healthcare that has become entrenched. The shortage of family doctors, 2.5 million Ontarians without one. Everything else associated with the emergency departments being closed. All of these files have just gotten worse and worse, especially in parts of Ontario where they get Conservative MPPs elected. There should have been a signal here, a new Minister of Health coming in to address these key issues. I think in housing, obviously something has to be done because Calandra, for all his praise as being, a fixer and a guy that keeps things calm, he didn't get any housing built. I mean, the housing starts are way off again. Even the first 2 months of this year, they're so far off their targets. Something drastically has to be done. So I suspect some new policy has to come in there to province-wide policies to get more housing built. They're going to have to give right of way, as of right for 4 plexes or 6 plexes, these sorts of things. It's going to take, a new minister coming there, but I don't think Calandra did a great job there. And why is he going over to education? Does it need a fixer right now? Most of the contracts have been signed, or are they planning something in education that's going to upset the teachers or get them angry again, or continue cuts as the teachers see it. And then, we need Calandra to sort of keep a lid on those sorts of things. But again, to my first point, I really think that keeping Sylvia Jones in as not just the health minister, but the deputy premier as well, was just the wrong signal. There's a huge problem there, and it needs to be addressed, I think, with the new minister.
John?
Well, I'm of the view that we're not really going to have much on the domestic front in Ontario until probably at least June. And the reason is just this massive tsunami headed our way. I mean, we're going to be distracted by a federal election, which will be called on Sunday, and end up on probably April the 28th. We're going to have tariffs, which will be coming in on April the 2nd. We're going to have all of those things in between. And the premier, I think, and others are going to have their hands full with the other premiers, where, you know, Danielle Smith meeting with Mark Carney has basically declared almost independence. So we're going to end up with, I mean, the Conservatives blow a 20-point lead, and all of a sudden Alberta wants to separate. I've never seen the declarations that she's put out ever before. So we'll see what happens with that. But I don't know, you know, I share Keith's point of view that the health ministry is a concern. Not so much just in terms of the deputy premier and her abilities, but it's a file that needs communication, and she just doesn't communicate. So I thought there would be some change there. So I think Mr. Ford is going to be concentrating on a lot of things that are coming from outside the province, and particularly on the trade issue. There's two fronts on that. One is, how do you respond to what's going to happen? I mean, the premier in the last few days has effectively said Ontario's position is, let's see if we can be first in line to get exemptions. I'm not sure when that's going to happen. A piece in the New York Times this week indicated from sources in the White House and other places that Mr. Trump is basically going to do reciprocal tariffs, and because he believes in them. We all thought, all of us, that this was a means to an end, that there was a negotiating point for something, when in fact it's actually he wants to go ahead and do this because he believes it will work for America. So we're going to be stuck with it. We've now got Chinese tariffs on. So that's a lot of bandwidth for this premier to deal with, and for all of us. And I think what it's going to produce is a huge amount of anxiety. I think, you know, when you look at the GDP numbers coming out of the United States and Canada today, and you look at what, you know, whether the housing market is already shrinking, and you know what this all means, it's like looking just offshore and seeing this wall of water heading towards us. And I think that's going to consume almost all of his time.
Kathleen, I want to pick up on the GDP numbers, because that to me tells the story that is concerning most about it, and that is to say that the tariffs are going to have such an effect on Canada's economy that I think the GDP number was predicted at like 0.7 or something in the next 2 years, year after year. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of jobs. That's a whole lot of instability in the economy.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to come back to the cabinet for a sec, because I have a couple of things that I want to say about that. But yes, I mean, there is no doubt, as John has said, there's a whole wall of trouble coming at us, and we have to be ready. We have to have leaders at the provincial and at the federal level who are working together. You know, Ford for now is the chair of the Council of the Federation. That will be done this year. It's a 1-year cycle, and then someone else will take over. So for the moment, he has some agency in pulling together the premiers and coming up with a plan, which is a challenge. I mean, you've talked about Danielle Smith. You know, you've got premiers in the Maritimes who are not running again or who have resigned. So it's a very unstable moment. But I do think that, you know, obviously I'm banking on Carney winning, and I think that that working with the Prime Minister now, and if he is able to win in the election, which I know is that's a big hill to climb, but I think we'll start to see some coherent strategy. I mean, one of the things that I have been concerned about is that I'm not sure the degree to which, and I was more confident actually before, that there was a good conversation going on between the officials at the provincial and the federal level. That's really, really important. So to the degree that can't happen as we go into a federal election, that's concerning. So we want that stability. In terms of what's going on here at home, and I agree that it's going to be hard to focus on issues in the province. But the reality is that in people's lives, those are the things that matter. You know, it matters what's going on in your kid's class, whether there are too many kids in the class, whether there's a teacher shortage, whether we don't have any French teachers. All those things are really a challenge. It matters if someone you love is in hospital and they're not getting the care that they need. So, I worry, like Keith, that, keeping Sylvia Jones there, maybe that's a caretaker role. Maybe there's a perception that, she can just keep a lid on it as she has, or maybe they perceive she has. I think that it's bubbling under the surface and it's going to cause a lot of trouble. I also think Paul Callander was, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was in long-term care at one point, right? He had carriage of long-term care. Well, if he's going into education to do what he did in long-term care, which was nothing, then that is a real problem. So I think he's a communicator. I think that he's able to, to sound like, and I sat in the House with him for 4 years. He sounds like there's a lot going on, and there isn't necessarily. So as a former, Minister of Education, I really worry that having a person like that who's just going to try to spin a story at a time when we actually need, I think right now we need a really big review of education in this province. We need either a royal commission or something. There hasn't been anything since the mid-90s. We've got post-COVID, we've got technology. There's a whole lot that has changed, and our education system is not keeping up. So I think that having somebody like Paul Callander there could be a real problem. So I think there are lots of Ontario issues. It's interesting. I'll end on this, Dave. I promise I'm going on. But see, that's what you do when you let me go away for a while.
I was going to say you're off for a month and now we can't shut you up. That's good.
Exactly. But I think it's really interesting. Steve Clark didn't go back into cabinet, right? So what does that say about what's coming down the pipe in terms of the Greenbelt? So I think there are lots of landmines that this government is going to have to deal with, much as Doug Ford would like to just deal with the macro issues. And of course, they're important. There's lots of stuff going on at home.
Yeah. So when you add all of that into the soup, Tim, I mean, with the GDP numbers, the education, the questions around Greenbelt still out there. Oh yeah, there's that. That tends to be something that, on the corollary, can distract from the tariff issues going on south of the border. I mean, for this government, the real challenge for this government, I think, is going to be able to maintain its focus in the moment, and not just meet the moment, but be able to be sharp and focused at all times. There's not going to be a lot of wiggle room here for them.
Oh, well, like 2025 is the craziest year that I can remember being part of public life or just being a fan on the sides. Like, it's nuts. So yeah, for sure, Dave, for sure. So let me just comment on the taste of the soup a little bit here. I think the greater risk actually for cabinet is there are 37 members of cabinet. That sends the wrong incentives. It's bloated, and it's a risk because every cabinet minister is going to feel they need to prove the value of their portfolio. It can be chaos. It means at a time that is very challenging and can switch on a dime that you could get distracted because just too many voices around the table driving the agenda that they're paid to advance. I think that's actually the most disappointing side. I think Sylvia Jones is a very talented, competent, smart player. Like when I was leader, she was in my caucus, so I always gave her lead roles. So no surprise to me that she remains deputy premier and minister of health. I think the health system is like a bit of a jalopy that you repair for a while. You sort of paste together, throw some duct tape and some more gas in the tank, and it's going to break down again. It's the nature of our system. I think she's strong. And Paul Callander, yeah, he was at long-term care for a short time, but there he actually calmed the waters, got investments going, and expanded care in more homes. And then he was quickly moved into municipal affairs after that because of the Greenbelt scandal. So he is clearly, and he did a very strong job as House Leader. Premier regards him as a talent who's good at managing issues, putting out problems, and keeping negative things off the radar.
Let me guess, Tim, that healthcare jalopy could be fixed with a nice new private car from the private sector.
Give me 2 cars in the driveway, Keith, and we can spend a whole show on that, right? Give me some choice in the system and such. But I just believe that a command and control healthcare system, no matter what government's in office, is doomed to break down from time to time.
Well, here's the problem, though, Keith. I mean, I get what you're saying, but to do that, even reconsider or reviewing deeply and kind of coming up with a new game plan for education or healthcare or long-term care is going to require an incredible amount of bandwidth and oxygen at the government level that, again, I go back to, they need to be focused in the moment right now, very sharp. They don't have a lot of wiggle room to be distracted from anything. Quite frankly, we don't have the attention span to deal with the big issues right now.
Well, we're going to have to make a little room for it. I mean, the nurses are going out today in front of every hospital in Ontario, just demanding this is a fairly simple fix. Let's set nurse to patient ratios, because right now they're just so far off the charts. Patients are waiting, as we know, 18, 24 hours sitting in a chair in an emergency department, if it's open, before someone can actually check on them and see what's going on, what their issues are. So I think, there has to be room for the healthcare system to be addressed. And seriously, I don't, Premier Wynne talked about a serious overhaul review of the education system. I don't know that we can, encompass something that large at the healthcare system without addressing some specific needs right away. And some of them are funding, and some of them are, specific ratios that need to be set here and done without paying the private sector twice or three times as much for the same procedures that we're performing in the public sector. This has to be addressed seriously, and the government has to be challenged on this. It's going to be harder, of course, for the Liberals to do this in the legislature, even though they have official party standing now. Their leader is still not in the House. And so that's going to be difficult for her to sit on the sidelines. And I think that's going to be, we were talking about the leftovers from the election itself. I think that's the key one for the Liberals right now, is to, if they're going to have a leadership review, which I could be corrected, but I think is mandatory after an election, they should have it fairly soon to decide, as I think Tim talked about earlier, whether Bonnie Crombie has the support of the Liberals, whether she can stay around for 4 years until the next election, whether someone's likely to be willing to step aside within a year or so to give her a seat to run in, or whether, there's going to be someone else challenging her for the leadership. They need to settle that now, because otherwise they're just going to be that third place party floundering while the government gets away with saying everything about Trump and the tariffs, and they're just, staying focused on what they want to stay focused on.
John, on that point of the question around, the Liberal leadership, do you anticipate that the Liberals will just be quiet and move on and leave Bonnie where she is? Because having instability there is not necessarily good overall in terms of what the province needs right now.
I don't think she's going anywhere soon. She managed to bring the Liberal Party back to the legislature with some good numbers, and she'll have some time to pick a seat. There will be some pressure on her to do so, but I'm not sure where she's going to run or when. We'll have to wait for an opening there. Plus, we're going to be, as I keep going back to this, we're going to be distracted by whatever happens in the federal election campaign. And the numbers on that, well, the Conservatives certainly have dropped, and every poll that I've been seeing in the last 24 hours has the Liberals ahead. All of us on this podcast know that campaigns matter. Again, people are still getting used to Mark Carney, and we're not exactly sure whether he's going to be able to campaign in the same way that normal politicians would be able to campaign. So we'll still wait and see where that's at. But I think that she's got some time to do that. What'll be fascinating for me is how she plays a role in opposition to the government once it gets back into the legislature. Once, how is she going to establish her platform? What look does she want to have? There's some production issues, if you can put it that way here, where, it's just pure execution. How will she critique the government from being outside the legislature? Does she want to give that a particular look? Does she always want to be in the Queen's Park studio, or does she want to have something else developed? I'm more on the technical side of it right now. I don't think she's necessary for the debate, because there really isn't a debate for the short while. Where she'll come into, where it'll be necessary, is how the Premier and the province responds to the tariffs. That's going to be all hands on deck to see that workers and families are looked after. And that may not require her to be in the legislature, but nonetheless, as I said, she's going to have some kind of a perch to do it from. I'll be interesting to see how she does it.
So when we look at what happened just 2 weeks ago, just right out of the election, and
was that only 2 weeks ago?
Right? and
to
exactly.
Tim's point, it's a crazy year.
No kidding.
Wild.
Well, but even when you think that everything was on fire, when Ford was heading down to meet Lutnick and all of those sorts of things, and everybody was in the media and they're just throwing spitballs at each other. They came out of the meeting, Kathleen, and said it was a productive meeting. and everything has gone quiet. The follow-up meeting was not involved. It didn't involve politicians. It involved the actual officials in the ministry and the departments that are involved in this.
Right.
I'm taking that as a positive. You?
Yeah, I mean, on the radar, starting the relationship, and as I've said before, the conversations between the officials are so important. So, for Ford, it was part of an election strategy, and it worked. But I think the substantive part of it was that, as I say, we're on the radar, on somebody's radar. Who knows whose radar? I mean, it's just really hard to know, Dave, exactly who's paying attention to whom. I think that Ford has done a good job in terms of the message that he's been delivering in the States, not just in these meetings, but on media and so on. So I think that there are quiet conversations going on. Honestly, there will be conversations going on every single day. There will not be a day. And Tim, you were down in Washington, so that there are different relationships. People will have different connections with, whether it's governors or whether it's members of Congress or whether it is, officials in Ontario talking to officials in the States. So I don't think anybody should worry that those conversations are not happening. Whether President Trump pays any attention to what he's told as a result of those conversations, that's the wild card, literally. You just can't assume that strategies that are rational and that have been used in the past are going to work with this man. I just think that's what's keeping everyone on tenterhooks right now.
Yeah, agreed. Tim, I think that's the issue. And on the positive, again, I think that it's quiet and that we're having these conversations in a relatively mature way is encouraging. But on the other hand, I keep hearing members of Trump's cabinet come out and say, well, if this happens, then this will happen and that will happen. For example, on the retaliatory tariffs and so on. So, we may not have the exact list right now that you think you have when everything falls into place on April the 2nd. And within a breath, there's a whole flurry of activity, and the Trump administration is trying to backpedal it or trying to reaffirm it or change the direction or change the channel. His own cabinet doesn't know what the hell's going on.
It's so true.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Yeah. You certainly, as Premier Wynne said, certainly picked that up when I was down in Washington, D.C. as part of Premier Ford's Ontario Day, where we had Republicans saying they agree. They don't know why Canada's in the crosshairs. Let's turn our trade guns on China. But then they'll also say, Dave, but I'm not going to say anything quite yet, or I don't want to get primaried in the time ahead. I remain an optimist in all this. And yeah, I think the bad news is we're just on the first hill of this roller coaster. We could be looking at, 8 to 12 months of this, but I do think we'll hit flat track. And here's the main reason why. I just think that Canada is so interconnected economically and culturally that the president ultimately won't be willing to accept the pain of impacts on stock market and inflation and push back from his own members over time. Now, if it were ideological, if they truly believe that tariff barriers will cause an economic revolution, they're willing to gut that out for 2 or 3 years for new factories to pop up in the States, that's one thing. But I think that President Trump is so transactional and has so many other major issues on his plate, from Gaza to Ukraine to Europe and domestic issues, that I feel optimistically that there will be a deal that is made for the benefit of both the U.S. and Canada and not jump off the cliff.
Yeah, Dave, if I could, I just want to jump on Mr. Ford's trip to Washington, just briefly. I mean, what he did there was, he came out and he said they've agreed, both sides have agreed to turn down the heat. That was his success there, and to get a future meeting. And indeed, I think to your point that the rhetoric is absolutely dialed down on both sides for the most part. But Premier Ford has gone so far to try and keep the things smooth, and we hear him professing his love for Americans and all that sort of thing. This week, he went so far as to say it was a compliment for President Trump to suggest we become the 51st state. How great is it that they consider us so great they want to have us as part of it? I think that was a step too far. He didn't repeat it in his cabinet speech yesterday, I noticed. I think, saying that it was a compliment was just a little step too far for a premier who I think has done pretty well in this file overall, slapping on the electricity tariff and then being very quickly willing to back it off, knowing that that's what he was doing and was going to have to do. And that it actually got Trump's attention. Remember, Trump said, he didn't name for it, but he said, there's a politician in Ontario, he took that tariff off. That was a smart thing. He's a strong man. That's the kind of attention we got. Now we have the officials do the talking. But as I say, you can go so far to calm the waters, but claiming that being talked about as the 51st state is a compliment, that's not helping.
But Keith, remember, this is a guy who he wanted Trump to win. He said
Yes,
he wanted Trump.
yes.
He didn't want Kamala Harris to win. Kamala Harris, who is a progressive and is rational and is smart. He didn't want that person. He wanted the wild, rich guy who's a bully. That's who Doug Ford wanted to have win the election. So underneath all of the sort of pushback he has to demonstrate right now, and I think he believes it. He obviously doesn't want Ontario or Canada's economy to tank, but fundamentally he doesn't hold a lot of disdain for this guy. He actually admires him. He wanted him to win the election. So that's where he will trip into some kind of respect for Donald Trump that a lot of us just don't have.
Well, John, if on the one hand, Ford wanted Trump over Kamala Harris, it was interesting to see that all the noise and oxygen that was taken up in media this week because Trump said he would prefer to have a liberal in the prime minister's office in Canada. And oh my God, we got so distracted chasing that car. It was hilarious.
Well, I find the premier to have been, I was asked this question earlier this week, and somebody said, well, is he a diplomat? And I said, well, I found him to be a really pragmatic diplomat. This is a very different Doug Ford than when I covered him doing polling at City Hall. I mean, he was really pugnacious and really difficult in many, many circumstances. I didn't find him a particular bridge builder then, but take a look. I mean, he right out of the gate, where he found necessity to have a relationship with Chrystia Freeland, which he was back on social media again this week, and then with Dominic LeBlanc and with other people. I mean, he's got relationships that matter. I think where all of us misjudged, all of us, was the impact that Donald Trump was going to have on the world and how he was going to turn it upside down. I mean, if you saw Donald Trump as being somebody who was going to be the alternative to Kamala Harris, who really had no agenda. I mean, honestly, there wasn't anything on the border. There wasn't anything on the economy. There really wasn't anything on what mainstream the United States, America wanted. That's true. And what she called out is what we're getting, but she wasn't dealing in the campaign trail with the stuff that was necessary. I think the premiers, can be duly shocked like the rest of us that, Russia maybe handed Ukraine on a silver platter. The war in the Middle East is being turned upside down and is now in a war zone, even more so than it came to be. Everybody's scrambling with NATO and every other European organization to try and have trade relationships, and China's suddenly come to the fore because of all of this with tariffs. I think everybody can be forgiven, that Donald Trump, we thought, was going to just focus on America. And yes, there was going to be some troubles outside as he got to a negotiating point. We also, as I said, it was all to kind of reopen everything. No one ever thought that it would come this fast and it would be to this dimension. I mean, I was listening this morning and there was a writer on the radio who was talking about a new book that he's got out that really talks about, the demography in the United States and how the United States is going to come apart. I mean, Donald Trump is causing such a disruption. I don't think any of us ever felt that this would be happening. But I think the bigger question is, how is America going to handle this? So again, I think the focus over the next number of weeks is just going to be trying to hold us all together. And I think the premier is going to have to make sure that he has all of those relationships in place. And I think the other premiers are too. And that's why, again, I come back to the Danielle Smith move in the last 24 hours, which is really quite remarkable given what the country's dealing with.
Well, I mean, you've already alluded to it, John, that we're, facing another writ period, this one federally, and off we go. How does that play into this interregnum at Queen's Park in terms of how the province is going to prepare for the next federal government? Is that top of mind at all?
Well, I think that Doug Ford has he's got a lot of work to do. What I would be doing if I were the premier at the moment would be to just take my tariff group and sit down and trying to figure out what the impact of all of this is going to be and how we're going to fund it and deal with it. The slowdown in the economy is going to be a massive distraction. I don't think we should underestimate the impact of what we're going to have. And so the federal election and how this plays into it, frankly, if I were him, I'd basically tell all of our cabinet ministers and everybody else to just take a powder on this and sit it out, go do your homework, get ready for the stuff that's to come. I think, we're going to have a campaign where the Conservatives federally, where Doug Ford, we know, hasn't got much of a love interest in, is going to let this thing play out. But I really think that this is now a period of time over the next 2 months where the government of Ontario has got to get down to business to figure out what's coming, because it's like COVID. You can see it. It's coming. This time you've been through it once before. You now got to figure out what to do this time. I don't know what else you would be doing.
Yeah, go ahead, Kathleen. I was just going to say that the interregnum is between now and the 14th of April and then the 28th. So there are these 2-week, 3-week periods where what do we do? We just seem to be at risk of drifting.
Well, sometimes that's what it looks like. I don't think that actually will happen. There will be a ton of work being done at Queen's Park. All those ministers have work that they have to get back to. The ones who have been in the files, and the new ones obviously have to come up to speed. The MPPs have a lot of constituency work to do. There will be lots going on. I just wanted to hear Tim talk about whether he thinks Ford will do what John has said. Do you think that the whole Ford team and all the volunteers actually will stay out of the federal election? Because that's the question in terms of time spent. Like, are you going to be focusing on being part of that federal election campaign in one way or another, or are you actually going to be focusing on your work? Because it's a tough position that the Ontario Conservatives are in, because there is, as John said, there is no love lost between Poilievre and Ford, obviously. So I'm just fascinated. I know what Liberals are going to be doing, but I don't know what the Conservatives are going to be doing provincially.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure I got a good line on sight of this. And thanks for the question. I think there's really 3 classes of Conservatives, provincial species. So I think that those in elected positions and senior staff will obey the Premier's commandment to stay out of the federal election. He's given that clear. Get too much focus on here. Don't get caught up in that or distracted. Second class will be probably some staffers that are angling for a job if Poilievre wins in Ottawa. Climb up the ladder, interesting experience, national mandate. So I think you'll see some skirting around the rules there. Volunteers you can't really control, nor should you. So you'll have many of the volunteers who help out provincial campaigns will still get active in the national campaign because they want to win. And Poilievre has energized that group of people very, very well. So I think that's how they'll react. Federal election is critically important, obviously. The obvious reason, the next prime minister does need a mandate to negotiate with the president, the administration, but equally importantly, to galvanize the country and to bring the premiers together. It's hard to do that without that authority. But here's the other reason why it's most important. In talking to senior leaders at the political level in the civil service in Ontario, they're very frustrated with the paralysis in Ottawa. So to Dave, to your point, that they do feel that there is, because of the vacuum in leadership, they don't really have their game faces on. They're reacting instead of being proactive. That's probably the most important reason why we need a federal election, to have whoever wins focus like a laser on the big issues, both civil service and elected officials.
Yeah, Keith, this is going to be the battle for Captain Canada as well. Ford right now wears the cape. Understandably, Carney is stepping into that role. But within, the next 5 weeks, the prime minister, whoever it is going to have to assert himself in that role. And, again, what does that do in terms of the dynamic at the first minister's meeting?
Well, one of Doug Ford's real strengths is he plays well with others. And this became clear during the pandemic, and that relationship he developed with Chrystia Freeland, and then later down with Trump, with Dominic LeBlanc. Olivia Chow was a real nemesis. He worked well with her, getting deals done with her. So crossing political lines and making deals and getting stuff done, that's part of his core. So I think he's more than willing. I think he's even kind of suggested that, if Carney wins, that he's, absolutely willing to work with Carney. He said, but I don't really know Poilievre that well. But I think there's an awful lot of conservative common ground that could be had there if Poilievre becomes prime minister. I don't think Doug Ford will have a particularly tough time working with him, especially now that he's got his election out of the way and he's got his 4-year mandate ahead of him. So he's not going to worry if Poilievre takes some, hard conservative cuts that affect Canadians. Ford won't have to pay a price for it. So I think he can work well with all of them. But as I say, I think that's his real strength. And that's what Canada needs right now. So we've got Ford playing, as you say, Captain Canada, wearing the cape. He may take the cape off and don it over the prime minister, but he may still be the one that comes with the strongest attacks, especially when the prime minister wants to stay above the fighting and say, look, I've got some provinces that they're just going to fight you on this. I can't control this. The electricity export's a great one. Again, it really, clearly gets a jolt right through to the White House, right through to the Oval Office, it seems. So Ford can, maintain that role, especially if the prime minister wants him to play that role. He'd love it, and it'll fit him well. And again, leave room for the prime minister to sort of stay above the fray, but try and get an actual deal of whatever we're trying to get it with, or some goalposts that we can actually see that stay in place with Trump and the administration.
But John, when we look at the date even for the federal election, and then we're going to have a cabinet installed, then we're going to have a throne speech, and all of these things are going to have to play out. The Trump administration doesn't know who they're dealing with until maybe into May, June?
Well into May. Yeah, absolutely. And that's just the way it's going to happen. I mean, what I heard this week in conversations that a few people had was that there are actually, what came out of that meeting in Washington was that the bureaucrats were actually starting to talk, and they were starting to lay some groundwork. And so, I mean, you let the process fold out the way it is. You let the president say what he's going to say. And again, I think we've heard a different tone from the premier, where it was before we want these tariffs taken off, to we want to be first in line for exemptions. It's a very different positioning on this. I've alluded to it twice, and I'd be interested in the panel's discussion on it, because what Danielle Smith has declared in the last 24 hours is remarkable. Again, it's this all. My dad was born in Edmonton, so at least I can claim that part of my genetic species has come from the West. But this just seems to be, one of those reactions to the fact that, the Conservatives were going to win. We're all in. Oh my God, they've blown this lead. So now we got to leave. We'd rather be with the United States. And it's just triggered this Western what will be a constitutional challenge, or the friction that's happening. I mean, it seemed that everybody except Danielle Smith, a little bit with Scott Moe, was trying to, play with the levers that they had to try and get in and put pressure on the United States. It wasn't with Danielle Smith, and now it's kind of like, well, if we don't get our way, we're going to leave, or we're going to rebel or something like that. And this is just, it's more than a distraction, because it'll be one more thing that the government has to deal with in addition to Donald Trump, and it will involve the premiers, and then we're up against the G7, with all of that, with Zelensky coming. So I wonder, how unsettling this is going to be with the West going in the direction that, she wants to lead it.
Yeah, well, Tim, it's the exact opposite of what you described in terms of the strategy coming out of Queen's Park. I mean, just sit on the sidelines and shut up. That's not happening. I mean, just, blatantly saying Carney's going to be worse than Trudeau, and we know she wasn't a Trudeau fan. So, take it from there.
Yeah, Alberta can be a different animal, and Danielle Smith, they're very different approach than Premier Ford. Sort of cut her teeth together, climbing up the ladder. We're opposition leaders at the same time. She got across finish line. Kathleen Wynne stopped me. But I think I'm going to guess, right? This is guess for Alberta politics. I think it shows outside of character the deep wounds that still exist from the National Energy Program and the real distrust of Ottawa on all things energy, including pipelines. I do think there is a risk that the Prime Minister Carney will play an anti-Alberta card to divide the nation, knowing they're not going to win votes there, to try to succeed in Quebec, Ontario, and East, by being very aggressive and saying we are going to cut off oil, gas. We have to have cards like that can help galvanize the issues Premier Ford did around the Trump and trade and standing up against the Americans, cater anti-Americanism. I think there's a risk to toss Alberta overboard.
So can I just weigh in on this?
Please.
When I became Premier, Alison Redford was the Premier of Alberta, and then Rachel Notley became the Premier. And with Alison, obviously it was a bit more of a challenge, but I felt like, and I was I was in Ford's position at that point. I was the chair of the Council of the Federation. And I felt that it was very important that I go out to Edmonton, that I talk to people in Alberta, that I demonstrate, because we were trying to talk about a Canadian energy strategy at that point that everybody could sign on to. And so I went out and spoke to the Chamber of Commerce. I think I was in Calgary. So I think, to Keith's point about the relationships, maybe there's a role for Doug Ford to play here with Danielle Smith. Maybe it would be a great idea for the Premier Ford to do a kind of foray into Alberta and have some one-on-ones, talk to some people about what's going on in Alberta. I just think that that's something that could usefully happen over the next few weeks while we're in the middle of a federal campaign, because we've all said he's got the Captain Canada hat right now. Who knows where it's going to go after this? But I think that he could be very helpful in kind of trying to have that conversation. That's something, if I were in his chair, I'd be having that conversation with my staff and talking to them about how we might broker a trip out to Alberta at this particular moment.
Yeah, Keith, it would probably be more effective optically and productively than the trips to Washington were. And I'm not suggesting that wasn't necessary, but in this case,
this could really work.
Let's put this fire out.
They've got a lot of common ground, and he could absolutely, I think, play a key role in that particular position. It's smart. It's just smart politics. And again, that's he's the leader of the provincial Confederate Council of the Federation. That's his job to do right now. So that would be perfect. I think, if the Liberals win and if Carney is going to, sort of do something that it basically in Alberta is going to equate to a revision of the National Energy Program, the very same minute he better announce pipelines going to both coasts. Otherwise, this will become a serious constitutional crisis. I mean, Alberta is just feeling really dogged by this. I understand their position to some degree, but we need them playing, on the team. We need everybody on side, and say Alberta and to a lesser extent Moe and Saskatchewan they weren't willing to do that to the same degree that we would like to see. So this is the role I think that Doug Ford can absolutely, as Premier Wynne points out, Doug Ford could absolutely fit that in right now. He's got the time. And I would think, as you say, David, more productive than actually going to Washington. He's done his thing in Washington. He's got all the attention he's going to get there, as far as I can see, as a provincial premier. So yeah, focusing on the national scene. But again, if Alberta is going to be hampered with the exports, if we're going to somehow restrict the exports or tariff them, whatever, put a levy on them, we have to be giving them some absolute foresight that there will be pipelines, there will be new markets for them in the East and in Europe that they'll be able to get their product to, and not, Quebec's going to have to come up here and agree to a pipeline going to Tidewater. That's all there is to it. I think getting one to BC can be done fairly easily, but getting one to the Quebec, New Brunswick, it's going to take federal leadership and Quebec agreeing to come along with this. It's got to stop.
But Ontario too, Keith. I mean, that pipeline, even though the pipeline is there, so it's not new pipeline like in Quebec, but still there has to be agreement in Ontario, because we were kind of able to stay silent a bit on that. But there was a lot of pushback in Ontario that would have come to the fore if that had moved forward. So it's Ontario and Quebec that need to be working with the feds on that.
Correct.
Interesting.
Yeah, and John, we talked about it last week after the leadership vote for the Liberals, that in fact, Prime Minister Chrétien Kearney some cover there, because he was the one that was adamantly banging on the desk saying we got to have the pipelines, and you know, he set the table for him. I mean, I realized it was good populist rhetoric in the room, but at the same time, you know, that got a cheer in the room too, and that was the Liberals who 86% said yes to Kearney.
Well, and if Kearney's main word in his speech was, "I'm a pragmatic leader," which meant, you know, off with the carbon tax. And I know people will say, yeah, but that's just, you know, signing with a order in council, and the legislation is still there. So we don't know whether or not when he gets back, he's going to keep it or raise it. Like, okay, fine. But if that's the tone that this prime minister has, then he does have, and he's meeting with the Premier of Alberta, he's got equally as much of a problem in Quebec. You know, Keith is absolutely hit the nail on the head. I mean, the Bloc Québécois came out a week ago, basically said, no, we're not on for this. It's for social reasons, whatever that means. I mean, and we haven't even talked about the Aboriginal community and how they're going to deal with this issue. But Quebec is the issue. Now, if Ontario said okay and it was to go through there, right now they're the stopping block. So maybe Premier Ford has got a series of plane tickets where he's kind of got to go to Alberta, and he's got to meet with the Premier there, and then he's going to fly into Quebec City and meet with Legault, and then he's got to come back to Ontario, and then out and back and out and back. Maybe that's the role that he's got to bridge while we're during an election campaign to come up with this. But you've got to let the pressure out of the pipe for Alberta. I'm not sure how you do it. And I don't know what the prime minister is going to say, you know, after meeting with her. But the reality is, it is, as Tim said, this issue has been around since Red Square. Oh my God! I mean, when I was an intern at the legislature, it was an issue. It hasn't changed, and it's vital. And especially now it is. But it's going to take a lot of work between Alberta and Quebec now, and you know, maybe Premier Ford has a role to play in that.
Just before we go, and in anticipation of the writ period starting next week, Sunday, is it more likely to be more effective to have a minority government in Ottawa deal with Trump rather than a majority? Kathleen?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would say that we need firm, decisive action right now. Like, I think that, yes, we need input from everybody, but we need to be able to move quickly. So unless there was some agreement among the parties in a minority situation that this was a plan, and I don't know what the likelihood of that would be, I kind of think whatever is going to allow us to move expeditiously, because of what we've been talking about, the uncertainty and the day-to-dayness of the decision making, or the invective from the White House. I think we need to be able to move quickly. So if having a minority would hamper that, I think it could be a problem.
Tim?
Great question for political science classes, across university campuses right now.
I know, I'm going to pose it to my class on Monday.
Graduate seminar.
There you go. So I'm of the view that at this point in time, you need to have a majority government. You could still do it in a minority, because I think largely parties would gather around and support during the storm. However, who's going to decide the ties, right? Do you think that Jagmeet Singh has displayed the acumen, the leadership, and the consistency to be the partner? Do you want the Bloc Québécois to be determining, which way we go? I think for those reasons alone, give me a majority.
Yeah, John, the only reason I ask is because the way the numbers have sort of floated, and I know you're watching them closer than anybody, is that, when you started looking at some of the seat projections last week, the Liberals and the Tories were within 10 seats in some cases, with the advantage going to the Tories. But, if you had the rest of the House ganging up on them, they wouldn't really have any consequential, decision-making ability without the other parties.
Yeah, and I think, I reflect on all the different, this will be my 11th federal campaign that I've watched or been part of. The only one that comes to mind is 1988 with Brian Mulroney and the free trade debate. And back then we had the raging grannies, and that was kind of the only thing we had to disrupt us. And there was a bit of a sentiment there about, well, we're going to join the United States. Remember, there was even a commercial back then that scribbled away the border.
Well,
So
David Orchard was on.
Yeah. So it's kind of reminiscent of that, but I can't sort of suggest or predict or even notion at the moment who's going to end up with one at the end of this day. It could be. I mean, thinking of Trump sitting there, just a day ago, looking into the camera and saying, well, I don't want to work with that stupid conservative. I'd rather work with a liberal. And then everybody else playing these mind games of three-dimensional chess saying, what did he really mean? I think Kevin O'Leary called him on the phone and said, you should say this and it'll be better. Who knows? All I do know is that Donald Trump and what he says about this whole debate and what he does could turn the election or turn the fortunes of a party on its ear 24 hours before the vote. I mean, you can get out of bed in the morning of the vote and basically say something that's outrageous. And then all of a sudden, everybody kind of goes, well, I don't know how I'm going to do that. So I think it was pretty easy to predict in 1988. In the last week, remember, it kind of switched. In the last week of that campaign, I think this is going to come down to the hours. And I can't tell you how it's going to end up. I really can't.
All right. Well,
I will say that a majority will be better than a minority. That's for sure.
I just want to weigh in that I think Canadians generally prefer a minority government. I think they find it more accountable. This would not be one of those situations. I think Canadian voters as well would like to see a majority government, if only for the fact that Trump would view a minority as weakness, if nothing else, let alone the decision making and the time and all that sort of thing. Trump would view it as weakness, and any prime minister would just be open to being, Zelensky in the Oval Office.
The only thing I want to add, I just throw it back to the crew, but I think this is going to be more about character than policy. I think the pivot problem with the Conservatives is, and you do hear it all the time, and it is in, whether you look at Abacus numbers or Ipsos or anything like that, Pierre Poilievre's a nasty guy. I mean, you hear that all the time, and it shows up in the research, which means that if you're going to judge on character, then there's going to have to be a pivot pretty soon. And it's going to have to be better than kind of holding your wife's hand and walking in a field of wheat. It's
even that commercial, the tone in his voice, he's yelling at you in that commercial as opposed to talking to us.
Well, and that's the thing.
Aggressive.
Part of this is people want a conversation. They want calmness. And it's really tough when you've labeled somebody, and that is what you believe the campaign's all about. And all of a sudden they've left the room, right? So how do you do that? So it'll be interesting to see, for me, the transformation, if possible, of Pierre Poilievre in moving his whole character into a different mode over the next 2 weeks.
And the thing is, people are actually scared, right? They are actually scared about their lives. And so they want to feel safe. And I guess that's why when we talk about minority versus majority, I think people would feel safer with a majority, depending on who's leading it. If they chose, I think they want that certainty, and they're going to want the person who's going to make them feel safest, because everything is so uncertain.
I'll just add the other side of the coin as we're wrapping up. Carney's never been on the ice. He's never skated at the professional level. So, I tend to default by who's going to be the better athlete to respond to where the puck goes, and my money's still on the Conservative majority. So,
Tim, is it the player or is it the team around him though that's going to make the difference here?
Well, the Team Trudeau wasn't doing so hot, right? So I don't think that Carney's going to call this one in from the bench, right? It's his alone, and will he be seen as the reassurance that my colleagues have talked about here, the steady, smart hand? Just having been in the arena as Premier Wynne has, and John and Keith have been watching it for a long time. It ain't easy. And, coming from the background he's had, successful for sure, but will he have the common touch to come across to those voting at home as the one to actually lead our country forward by the end of the campaign? They may see that now. How will he perform on the ice?
Mm-hmm. But he's going to be compared not to the Almighty. He's going to be compared to Pierre Poilievre, right? And I think that's, as John has said, if Pierre Poilievre can have an actual makeover, I mean, he's done all the cosmetic stuff, but if he can actually have a personality change, then he's got a shot at it. But that nastiness, that edge, puts a lot of people off. And so, I mean, it's going to be fascinating to watch.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Well, this is a good way to reboot the On the Ledge podcast. So thanks to all of you for stepping in, stepping up. Keith Leslie, Tim Hudak, Kathleen Wynne, and John Wright. And of course, again, if you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, that's great. You can share the show and make sure that you follow it. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on YouTube, because we actually post it there as well, just audio only. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you do that, you'll not only get notifications of On the Ledge, but Now and Next is also in the same feed. We've just rebooted that series as well. This week we have on Lindsay Broadhead, Bob Reed, Anne-Marie Akins, and they are our comms and strategy team. And they've got some pretty interesting insights into how a lot of this works out, specifically around comms and crisis comms situations. All right. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the weekend and buckle up. We're headed for another writ period, and it's going to be kind of exciting to watch, and we'll hope that you'll be able to do that with us right here on The Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast for Story Studio Network.
I have a YouTube channel right here, as you can all people see. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content. Look at this. Bye now.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.